watching at home, but.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad to know that.
A minute or two, I'm just worried about that's right. Worried about you.
Give it 1 minute. Generally, that's probably. If there's
If that brings us kind of word of including this part? Maybe we want to. Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. I probably did. Forgot.
Oh.
Well, hi everybody, welcome, and thank you for coming. My name is Mark Habib. I'm one of, is this work? Yeah. I'm one of the 3 authors today who will be talking about our books. I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel. And just to remind everyone, the Virginia Festival of the Book is a program of Virginia Humanities, which is the Commonwealth's statewide organization. It's the Commonwealth's official humanities organization, Humanities Council, whose mission is to connect people and ideas to explore the human experience. And one of the best ways to do that is through books and literature and conversations. So we're really happy to have you here today. There's a bookseller that's going to be on site, so we can do book signings after the panel. We have a lot to talk about today. Last week, Christina and Jeffrey and I got online on Zoom to just kind of talk about how we wanted to run this. We were on for an hour and a half, and our panel's only an hour. So, and that was just us. So, you know, we're going to hope to do time management well here, but there's also a lot of things to cover. We have, I'm going to say we have 2 wonderful books, and we have my book. We have Jeffrey Dale Lofton's recently released coming-of-age novel, Red Clay Susie. Christina Gorcheva, pronounce it right, The Orchard, Gorcheva Newberry, to say it correctly, and her novel, The Orchard, which is just coming out in paperback, right? The paperback version is just coming out. The hardback version hasn't been out. And my novel, Venice Beach, which came out in late 2021. And the interesting thing, and how these have been looped together, is called the panel title, which we didn't actually come up with, but is called Forbidden Dreams, Coming of Age Fiction. And the fact that that's the title they came up with says that the the book festival staff actually read the books. We were pleased with that. And it's the three books, as you'll hear about, and we're not going to give any spoilers away or anything, but they are very different settings, geographically, different eras, different family dynamics. But what they have in common is that they are about young people going through those coming of age years. And I think what's amazing, and what was amazing to me in reading Christina Jeffrey's book, were the commonalities, the struggles, and the challenges. I think it's safe to say, I've always felt that what people call the coming of age years is often mixed with, adolescence or teenage years or kind of other terms. And I think it's more than just a period of life that's wedged between childhood and adulthood. I see coming of age as a process. It's not a block of time. And I think for most of us, if we think about it, it's an emotional forge. It's where, if you think about the firsts that you encountered between, 12 and 21, or however you want to define those coming of age years, first loves, first heartbreaks, first sexual yearnings. And this is where the issue of taboo comes in, because a lot of times what you start to feel and what you start to yearn and what you start to realize who you are doesn't necessarily fit in with what society is telling you should be. And that's part of the struggle of that age. And I think very few of us get through that process unscarred. Certainly, very few of us get through that process unaffected, regardless of how you enter that process. Of course, everybody enters that process with different childhood experiences. It could be abusive, painful childhood experiences. It could be childhood experiences marred by physical illness. Could be a warm and loving family. But once you enter that period, a lot of the same questions, a lot of the same challenges seem to be there, regardless of the setting of the book or the characters or their background or their sexual orientation or anything else. A lot of the same challenges seem to be there. So what we've decided to do is we're each going to read a short passage from our books, just so that you can get kind of an idea of how we write, a little bit about who our characters are. And Christina, I'll ask you to read first, and then Jeffrey, and then I will bring up the end. Christina Gorcheva-Newberry was born in Armenia, raised in the Soviet Union, moved to the U.S. in 1995 after the fall of the Iron Curtain. She writes in English, which is her second language. She writes beautifully in English, her second language. I wish I could write as beautifully in English, my first language. Christina has published over 50 short stories, received 10 Pushcart Prize nominations, winner of the Catherine Ann Porter Prize for Fiction, and Tennessee Williams Scholarship from Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Raz Shoemaker Prairie Spooner Book Prize in fiction for her first collection of short stories, which is entitled What Isn't Remembered. Also shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize, which is a wonderful honor because that's a great prize given by Stanford University. And as I said, her first novel, she's written a lot of short stories, but her first novel, The Orchard, was picked by the New York Post as one of the best books of the year, and the paperback edition, the Penguin Random House Book Club title, is coming out now. So Christina will read first, and then Jeffrey, I'll introduce you, and you can read, and then I will read, and then we'll have a little conversation among ourselves, but we want to make sure that we have time for audience participation too.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for coming this lovely morning. It just occurred to me that we're all of age. We wrote adolescent stories. But also, I will be reading I do different passages when I do readings, depending on the weather. but I'm going to read a passage because it's spring, and spring is mentioned, but also it's March, and it's March of 1985, which is a crucial month and year for the Soviet Union, because that's when Gorbachev comes to power, perestroika starts. Of course, the fall of the Soviet Union takes place years later, but it is very important because that period of time, the book is mostly set in the 80s, it paves the historical and political context for the current war in Ukraine. So when people ask, what happened, what was going on? In fact, when the war started, my book came out 3 weeks after the war started, which was a very, very hard time for all of us. But a lot of people would write to me and say, we had no idea what happened back then, because very little is written about that period. I lived there, so I'm born with this, and the writer always brings books. So it's chapter 17. We were midway through our senior year when Chernenko became seriously ill and then died. By the time Gorbachev, or Michael the Marked, stepped into office in March of 1985, our country was flooded with doubt and grief. We had buried our communist leaders one after another and didn't really expect Gorbachev to last long. Some began quoting Nostradamus and the Bible, claiming that both mentioned Michael the Marked as the last ruler of Russia. Others called him the devil's messenger, with that liver-shaped spot glistening on his forehead, destined to stomp and smash our country under his stone hooves. My parents grew more somber with each day. For one thing, they worried whether they would have jobs a year from now, and for another, they weren't sure whether they would fit into that new world Gorbachev was determined to scrape from the debris of the old one. They said it would be like learning to walk again after being in a coma for nearly 70 years. My mother was more open to change than my father. She explained that it came from being a woman whose body had been in the throes of hormonal shifts since the age of 12. You learn to adapt, she said, to manipulate, to fool your mind. It must function just the same, even if your body feels as alien to you as those clouds, puffy, swollen, barely dragging. She stood by the window, sweeping the sky with her troubled eyes, then pressing her hands to her face and rubbing it furiously as though wishing to erase the image. That spring, we weren't yet 17, and our vocabulary had been extended by 2 words, perestroika and glasnost. And our history exam was about to be cancelled. As it turned out, we no longer had a history. Our country's past demanded drastic revisions, if not complete rewrites. We teetered on the cusp of happenings and importance, mostly because we didn't have to study for the exam, but also because we felt that we were privileged to witness the country's transformation from an impoverished, terrorized state into a free, prosperous, democratic world. We didn't understand and couldn't care about the time, months, effort it would require to rebuild our motherland. My parents kept saying, a picture doesn't hold but so much. You need to pour out before you're able to add, but we spurned their words, eager as we were to defy anyone who didn't believe in the future of our emerging democracy. Spring breathed in our chests, cold, gusty, fretful. The weather was moody, and the sun was in no rush to warm the numb, crusted earth. One morning, we would wake up to a sheet of snow, and the next, all would be washed away by a torrent of rain. Clouds hung over the city like large, puffy hats. Each day they grew bigger and grayer until the entire sky was engulfed by them. Occasionally, it would seem to us that we were inside a dinosaur egg, stuck in membranes and mucilage, and that the egg would never hatch, and we would never see the world, or that we would die as soon as we came out. It was our spring, nonetheless, and what we also thought about was graduation, a life without school, with teachers, or textbooks. In the summer, we would be applying to universities, and if matriculated, we would drag out another 5 horrible years of exams and papers. We didn't want to think that far ahead because that was how most people existed. Tomorrow could be a life away. Today, on the other hand, was all one moment. Love the moment because it never repeats, my mother told us when we got back from school one day. And Milka replied, what if I hate it? What if I don't want it to repeat? As much as my mother pitied Milka for her father's premature death, she also occasionally disliked her for her spontaneous honesty, her burst of smart anger, which my mother interpreted as involuntary self-defense, an instinct not only to survive, but to assure others that loss and suffering, after all, were noble Russian traits. Do you and your mother ever talk about your father, my mother asked. What for? No one remembers. I don't remember. My mother doesn't remember. And as far as my stepfather is concerned, the man never lived. That's not right, my mother said. Why? What would be the point in resurrecting him? He isn't Jesus. That doesn't mean he didn't love you and he didn't suffer. My mother said he died instantaneously. Doesn't she miss him at all? I don't think so. It's been 16 years. All the missing is gone by now. My mother asked. She remarried 6 months after the funeral. It's hard to be by yourself, especially with a small child. But did anyone consult that child? Maybe I didn't want a new father. I reached for another slice of the sweet sticky bread, but Milka intercepted my hand and grabbed the bread herself. She ate it with gusto, smacking her lips and licking her fingers as though suddenly awakened from a year-long sleep. A nervous tremor ran down her throat and disappeared between her breasts, which had finally begun to fall into shape. After Milka had left that evening, my mother kept saying that there was something wrong with her, that she seemed too mature for her age, but also too angry, too resolute. She even wanted to call Milka's mother and share her concerns, but I persuaded her not to, that it would be betraying my best friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. That's just so evocative and so beautiful. And that is her second language. It's pretty amazingly beautiful. And, one of the things that struck me about your book is I spent a lot of time in the former Soviet Union in those years, 86 to 91, and the way you describe that collapse of a society. And, here we follow that as news, just political implications, but there were people living it, and there were young people living it. There were young people in those coming of age years where people think about their future and what are they going to be and who are they, and everything's falling apart around them. So it's a very, very evocative book, a very powerful book. Jeffrey Dale Lofton. I want to emphasize here this is a panel of Southern authors because Christina has lived in Southern Virginia for
28
years. I went to Holland College. So
Radford University.
In Radford. So she's a Southerner. Southern is her first language. English is her second. Russian is her third. Jeffrey hails from Warm Springs, Georgia, which some of you may know is the home of Roosevelt's little White House, FDR's little White House. He lives in D.C. now. He spent a number of years on the stage, acting in D.C. theater community performed at Kennedy Center, Woolly Mammoth, Washington Shakespeare Company, Signature Theater, Studio Theater, and I'm sure you all remember his television appearance in a Super Bowl halftime commercial. You didn't send me a link to it. I want a link to that.
I've got to do that.
I want to see a link to that. And I'm only going to say this because you included it, which his accountant said is, quote, the finest work of your career.
Truth will out.
Jeffrey stepped away from acting and focused on, I take it, your other love, which is books and literature, and pursued a postgraduate degree in public administration and library and information science. He's a senior advisor at the Library of Congress today. Red Clay Susie is his first work of fiction. It was recently named a Lambda Literary Most Anticipated LGBTQIA Book, and it was awarded the Seven Hills Prize for Fiction. And I want to say something about, well, it'll come out in our conversation, but I also grew up in the South, and it's wonderfully abundant. So, okay.
Thank you so much. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm so excited to be here with you both and with you all. So this passage is from the third part of Red Clay Susie. It's written in 3 parts, so it's near the end. And the protagonist is named Philbot. And Philbot is gay with a significant skeletal deformity of the chest. And in this passage, he's about 16, almost 16 years old. And he spends most of his time trying to hide himself, his homosexuality, his skeletal deformity. And in this passage, he's talking to an older boy named Knox, a boy Philbot idolizes to distraction. Knox knows nothing of the skeletal deformity and wants to go swimming. And there is the conflict in the scene. Oh, one more thing. Knox has a nickname for Philbot, and that nickname is Keebler. Let's go swimming. I avoided swimming. That was a shirts-off activity. So I said, I don't swim. Oh, I'll teach you, Knox said. Oh, that's okay. Everybody needs to know how to swim. I know how, I just don't. Why not? Water gets in my ears. Little earplugs. They don't really work. Oh, come on, Keebler. It's so hot. Okay, you don't have to get in, but you're coming along. Let's go. And with that, he pulled me out to the door by the hand. And then he guided me towards the woods, his hand on the small of my back. Then I followed him down a steep but not deep gully and into a mostly dried up creek bed. And then we turned, and we were in the open, and suddenly the sun making us squint after having been in the shade of the piney woods, and a beautiful dark green lake spread out on all sides. He sat down on the bank and started to take off his shoes. Let's go, let's get in. No, I said, way too abruptly. Well, you don't have to put your head under. No! Well, okay. Before I lost my courage, I admitted, I don't want to take my shirt off, thinking the only thing worse than telling him about my deformity was for him to think I was a total weirdo. Oh, it's just, I never done that. It's because, Keebler, it's okay. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I took my shirt off, my chest fully exposed in the sunlight, and I just stood. See? He didn't talk. He just stared. My teenage fantasy was looking at what I spent hour after hour trying to hide. Say something, I thought. Does it hurt? Only when you don't touch it. I said it without thinking. What? Nothing. Just forget it. Forget it. I never felt more exposed than I did right then, with my shirt off, with my white, pasty, skinny, malformed bird chest in full view of the boy I loved. I mean, I didn't even know if he liked boys, much less freaky me. In the sun, it hurt so much because I couldn't hide. In the cavity in my chest, it was already a smaller space than my heart, needed to function. It just felt more compressed and restricted than usual. But I cherished this moment as much as I hated it. I mean, it hurt so much. Both the blood pumping heart in my chest and the feeling heart. The one I wanted to give to him. Was I going to die right here in front of him? But if I didn't take this chance now, I knew I never would. And if he didn't reject me after seeing my half-sunken chest, then I could trust him. I could believe anything that happened after that. He just stared at me. But I couldn't look back. As embarrassing as it was, the pain was not because I was disfigured and all my organs were fighting for room. I ached because somebody finally saw me.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I read your book and loved it. Now I'd like to have you come over and actually read it to me.
I would love to.
Can I cook for you guys while you do this? I gotta earn my living.
Be careful with the knife. But both of you, I think, so beautifully embody your characters. Your characters just are alive. They're just living. And it's something I'm going to talk about later. Do we embody our characters, or do they embody us? Once we start writing, do we become, in a sense, possessed almost by the character? So I'm going to bring up the end here and read just a short passage from my novel, Venice Beach. I, by the way, was born and raised in Alabama until I could escape, which was when I went to college. I went to college to Georgetown University, University of Sussex, England, and Johns Hopkins. I also studied in a special program of psychoanalytic theory at the Washington Center for Psychoanalysis, which actually I was doing while I was writing my book. It was in many ways very formative in thinking about the book. I currently, my day job is I teach in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I publish a lot of nonfiction, academic policy work, stuff like that. And I published some short stories. This was my first novel, which I worked on for 11 years. So it came out late in life, and one of the things I want to discuss with is Christina mentioned that we're writing books about adolescence from, several decades beyond adolescence. And for me, at least, I couldn't have written this any earlier. So there was a process there. So my book takes place in 1968 to 70. The protagonist is the same age I was then. It is not an autobiography. It plot and what happens, location and other things. But it does take place during that time. It takes place in Venice, California, Venice Beach, California, which was at the time a very down and out part of LA. It's kind of the Greenwich Village of LA. And it's about a young boy who's 13 years old who flees a very unhappy and abusive childhood. As I said, we enter coming of age from various different places. He happened to enter from a very unhappy and unpleasant abusive childhood, so he runs away from home, which a lot of 13-year-olds do. The statistics are quite frightening on that. And he's from the Midwest. He's from Ohio, and he goes to LA, which I don't know if people remember the old joke at the time. They put they tilted the United States on its side, and anything that wasn't firmly bolted down rolled to California. So this was that era, and there were a lot of street kids. There was a lot of people in LA, West LA, West Hollywood especially, in that area. So I'm reading from the early part of the book after he has arrived in this clueless 13-year-old has arrived in Los Angeles. I decided to go to California because it was far away from my home. and the television shows, it seemed like people always were happy there and the days permanently sunny. But sometimes I think that there were other things luring me there, and to Venice in particular, things I could not have known at the time, things that may not even be knowable. I didn't know what to do when I got to California. I had planned only the running away part, which I did quite well, thank you very much, and hadn't thought about what would happen when I emerged from that Greyhound bus. The more unbearable my life had become, the more desperate became my urge to flee. If I really had thought about being all alone in a huge city, I might have scared myself out of running away. So in order for me to carry out the first step, my mind prevented me from thinking about the consequences, which shows that you can't really trust your mind because you never know what it's up to. The mind is a sneaky little bastard. Even had I thought about it, I never would have been prepared for what I saw in the streets of Los Angeles, which I never would have seen in the streets of my hometown of Ohio. Lots of people who were not white, lots of hippies, lots of bums, lots of aimless teenagers, especially along Hollywood and Sunset Boulevards. I don't remember how I found my way to that part of town. It was like a magnet you could drift and bereft. No one bothered me much, not even the other teenagers, which was a great relief after middle school. But middle school is a holding pen for pubescent kids not ready to be unleashed into the real world. The kids in Hollywood and Sunset were already in the real world. They didn't need to mess with me. Most of the bums were so drunk or insane that they posed no danger, although I did get into a tussle with a scruffy man of indeterminate age who tried to pull my rucksack off my back. He was stumbling drunkenly but was strong. I had to keep twisting in spirals to free myself. Passers-by kept passing by. The hippies were harmless. They would ask me for money. Can you share some bread, little cat? But I had no bread to share, and they weren't persistent. I did share their fear of the police. I had thought dodging the police would be a challenge because they had always taught us in school that the police were there to help you and take you by the hand, lead you home if you got lost, which was the last thing I wanted. But the police didn't seem to care about us kids. Maybe they knew we weren't lost. Or maybe they had more fun harassing hippies and older teenagers. They sometimes rounded them up for no apparent reason and stuffed them into police vans. I was too young, with hair too short to draw attention. I could walk right past a police officer and he wouldn't even look at me. I usually liked being alone, away from my father and Jake, the bullies at school, and the empty vessel that my mother had become. But those weeks in Los Angeles were a different kind of alone. I wasn't alone in my room or in the backyard or down by the creek. I was alone in the universe, a vastly bigger stage. No one at home knew where I was, and no one in Los Angeles knew who I was. And after the first week, I too began to wonder where and who I was. There wasn't much to think about other than primal needs: food, water, shelter, safety. I was becoming feral. During the days, I roamed side streets, sat on bus stop benches and watched people go by, camped out in playgrounds or parks and drew pictures, nursed soft drinks in fast food restaurants. I read every free pamphlet and newspaper I could get my hands on and spent hours in the safe confines of the public library in Sunset trying to look like a schoolboy doing homework. Finding a place to sleep at night was my biggest challenge. With the 10 p.m. curfew for young people, I had to be out of sight. The cemetery would have been a perfect spot, except the idea of being alone in there all night creeped me. Because I was small, I could squeeze into tight places and stay out of sight, but these were usually disgusting places, between dumpsters, the alley doorways of abandoned buildings, places like that. My life those first weeks were a series of random motions, with no plot or meaning, other than responding to primal needs. I lost track of sunrises and sunsets, which were the only markers of time. I was unsure whether I actually existed or was just an observer of existence, whether I was dreaming or being dreamt. I sliced my arm one night with a shard from a broken bottle just to make sure I bled, to make sure I was still alive, to make sure I could still feel something. It bled all right, but I didn't feel much. I lay on my side under the loading dock behind a grocery store, my bleeding arm outstretched, my rucksack under my head, and I saw a weed that was growing between a tight crack in the asphalt. It sported a perfect little blue flower. It seemed happy, that flower, even though it lived in a crack in the asphalt under a loading dock. I wondered how it survived, why it survived, why it felt compelled to live and be beautiful in such an ugly situation. I stared at the weed and its little flower and cried. I fell asleep right there, dried blood covering my arms and hands.
So I think we're good. How are we doing for time? Because we do want to get some questions from the audience. We're going to maybe talk for 10 or 15 minutes, a little bit among ourselves. And I just like to throw out a question to you two, and I can answer it for myself too. But I often get the question, is your book autobiographical? Because when you're our age and you write a novel about adolescence or childhood, people immediately think, oh, this is an autobiography or this is a memoir. So I guess the question I'm asking is one of degrees. To what degree does your book reflect your own life? Or another way to put that, to what degree did your own life affect the story? How you wrote, even if the story factually is plot-wise is very different from your life. What part of you and your youth and your coming of age is in this story? With the court?
I'm happy to go first. So, Red Clay Susie, to use a literary term, is a fictionalized memoir. And I was born, like my protagonist Philbert, I was born gay with a skeletal deformity of the chest in Warm Springs, Georgia. We've established all that. And I've always lived as an outsider. And I actually started writing this novel soon after I left home, LaGrange, Georgia, Warm Springs, Georgia, to attend college in LaGrange, Georgia. LaGrange College is a small liberal arts institution, and it was only 30 miles down the road from where I grew up, but the biggest part of it was that it was away from where I grew up. And that change, that difference in my living situation, the first time I'd been away from home, it was as if a dam burst inside my head. My heart and head just burst open, and out flooded years of pent-up frustration and humiliation and anger. And I remember as early as 4 or 5 years old, back when we were called young'uns in Georgia, being the target of bullying and derision, even from members of my own extended family. And but when I went to college, I started to write about it. And that's when I started writing Red Clay Susie, when I left home in 1984 to go to college. And I found that it was an expunging of my insides. I've come to think of it as an exorcism by exposition. And but then my studies got in the way, as it happens when you go off to college. And I put the writing away. I had every intention of going back after not too long, maybe a semester after I got my college sea legs, but I didn't go back to the writing for 30 years or so. And so fast forward to a few years ago, and I read 2 books in succession: The Incandescent, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and Revisiting Scout. I read it as probably in high school, but reading it again with my adult perspective, it was a shock of recognition. This southern outsider child in those vividly drawn inhabitants of that town. And the next book on my to-be-read nightstand pile was the deeply moving Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman, which I didn't know anything about. Yeah,
Marvelous.
I didn't see the film. But anyway, I read that, and those 2 books together were like, it was the power of literature for me. I know you've all felt it. It was like 2 books rubbed together, like sticks of kindling by the most effeminate Eagle Scout ever. But it sparked something in me, and I picked up the writing. I went to those journals, and I picked them up again, and I started reading, and it's the most difficult thing I've ever done to read those again. But that is how Red Clay Susie was born.
I love that idea of revisiting books that had a powerful impact on you at different points in your life. Christine.
Well, I've been asked that a lot. I'm an immigrant, so say, well, you're from there. So I wrote actually the author's note because I just got tired answering those questions. My publishers were asking, my publicists, everybody was asking. And then the paperback came out, they asked me to write another essay on homeland. So I wrote another essay, put it in the paperback. So I told Jeffrey yesterday, I almost never write about the people I know. First of all, defeats, fiction writing. Fiction writing is about imagining places and people. And I also don't write about people I know because they block my imagination. They're there, I know them. However, the orchard grew out of my short story, Champions of the World. I wrote that short story as a student, as a graduate student at Hollins. And so it's a commemorative tale about a childhood friendship. Growing up in Moscow, I had a friend, a neighbor, and we were relatively close. And then she disappeared. And her family disappeared. There were rumors, ugly rumors. But nobody really knew what happened, so I made up a story. I think that I wrote this novel. I mean, there are one protagonist, but four main characters. And, I wrote it because I wanted to give them a home, a place to live forever. And I think Julio Cortázar once said that a story or a novel begins long before its first sentence and ends long after its last sentence. And I find it so remarkably true because it is all this life, all those experiences, all those loves and losses that a writer brings into fiction, especially fictional world, because they inform and define that world. Even though it's a fictional world, but all those characters are us. They ultimately grow out of us. I used to compare fiction writing that it's not that you're writing stories, you're growing trees. I mean, out of you, all those limbs, and they're, love and friendship and longing. And also, I think of fiction writing, especially novels, I think of them as second chances for first things. First love, first friendship, first marriage, first relationships. Only as fiction writer, hopefully I get to do it once again, only better. I get to, maybe create more depth, more understanding, more humanity, and I can change the ending. To me, that's the beauty of writing fiction. But it is informed, of course, by life itself. And, I hear writers who say, oh, if only I didn't have all those children, I could be just spending more time writing. Oh, if only I didn't have that husband I have to cook for. Oh, I didn't have to work, go to work, teach and all that. But you know what? That's part of you. That's part of a writer's life. All those people, all those experiences are part of me. So all writing essentially is autobiographical, whether we follow that plot or not, like you said with fiction. But it still comes out of us. So we give birth to those characters, to those books. Well, like children, only, you can be pregnant longer than 9 months. You can be pregnant for years. And then you finally push that book out. And the only difference that, the child you can still, control somewhat up until really, 16 or 18. The book, it's out in the world, you have no control of it. People read it, they like it, or they hate it, and you have no control. But it's your child. The mother and me.
What's the Toni Morrison quote we were talking about the other day about one of her novels where she said,
love is never better.
It's not real, but it's true.
Oh, it's when Yeah, it's when somebody, after she wrote Beloved,
Beloved,
and
yeah.
somebody was asking her, so what do you say? You're justifying, this woman killing her child, infant child, cutting its throat, and the woman did it so the child wouldn't live the same life, would be taken into captivity, raised as a slave. And Toni Morrison thought about it, and she later said it wasn't her phrase. She read it somewhere, but she said, so they said, "You think she did the right thing?" And she said, "Well, she did the right thing, but she had no right to do it." So that's that. And I also think it's come to think of Morrison. I always talk about Morrison, but well, I showed you the pictures. They're all over in my house. But I think that as writers, we go back to our past because we keep searching for answers we think must exist somewhere. And also that searching allows us to survive. In the world that we're, according to Morrison, we're all of us, the victims of something.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of almost the writing, or the writing this kind of novel as a form of psychotherapy in a way. You're kind of, it's a therapeutic process. And I get asked the question a lot too, as I knew we all three do, about whether this is autobiographical, and people will say, "I didn't know you ran away from home when you were 13. And no, I just fantasize about it every freaking day, but I didn't actually do it. Everything we write, even if it's fiction, it's still coming from us. It's still emanating from our experience, from who we are, from what we have suffered, our traumas in life, our yearnings in life, our cravings in life. It's still from there. I sometimes feel that Venice Beach, I described it as a waking dream when I wrote it, because I feel like there was this real dialogue between my conscious mind, which was writing the book, and my unconscious mind. And there were literally times where I would write a passage. I tend to write very late at night because then your inhibitions are down, especially if you have a bottle of wine. But where I would write a line or a passage or a dialogue, and I would sit back and say, where the hell did that come from? Because I almost like I wasn't in control of it. It was just kind of taking control of itself. But for me, I think my character is, and I realized this really until I finished writing it, it is not me. The plot is definitely not my life.
I was hoping.
Definitely not.
Get very worried.
I never ran drugs. But I realized I envied him, even though his life was not happy at all. But what I envied was his empowerment. He empowered himself. And he at age 13, he said, I'm going to die if I keep living here. And I'm going to have to, he empowered himself. He made a lot of dumb decisions, which are described. Decisions that could have gotten him killed, but they were his decisions. And I think it's that empowerment that I kind of envy about my character.
Right, he got to change his life.
Yeah.
Where sometimes
And make the decision.
Right, we don't get those chances in life.
Right, that's what resonated when you said a second chance
for first thing.
For first things.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
To right wrongs, even.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the reasons I decided to fictionalize my story is because there's a character that I introduce. It's the best friend, Philip's best friend from first grade through high school, and his name is James. He's insightful and funny, and
The African American.
yes, he's black, and so he helps Philip see the world in a very different way, and he's an outsider too. He lives in a world where racism, conscious and unconscious racism, is just a fact, and he and Philbert are kindred spirits because they're outsiders together. But there was no James in my childhood. There was a boy, a black boy, who I think maybe would have been my friend if I had only asked him to be. But I was afraid. I was afraid of rejection because I was so used to being rejected. And so that friendship never happened. So writing this character, creating this relationship is righting a wrong of sorts, creating what might have been if I'd only had the courage to act, but did not.
If you'd had the wisdom that you have now and look back on it, courage, you mentioned the word courage. I think writing these books, after yours is probably, as by your own admission, the most autobiographical. Mine certainly has things in it that are maybe revealing. Yours is certainly in terms of the time, the era, it's very much about what you've experienced. What kind of courage did it take for you to do that, to write that? I found it very hard because I've written a lot of nonfiction and academic works and policy works and stuff like that. And, you know, it's normal to have those works critiqued and criticized. And normally what you do is if some academic says this book is not right, you just say, well, he's an idiot, he knows what he's talking about. That's how the academia works. But if it's fiction, your baby, as you said, you know, if you show somebody your baby and they say, oh, it's a baby, then it's really difficult. And I was terrified before this book was released. So what did you find in terms of the courage to write what you wrote?
Well, I am in a bit different situation, mostly because my mother does not speak or read English. Therefore, I don't have to seek approval. And I do know you do not seek any approval from your relatives because and my husband wants to be fed, so he's not going to say anything bad. The rest of the people are not going to comment because they don't want to, you know, any kind of animosity. But courage is an interesting word, I think, that you use. I think just the courage of looking back at life and exploring things, you know, because we never know what could have been. We only know what is, right? And one of the best advices, I was telling you yesterday, one of the best advices that I got was at Hollins. He was a graduate student there. And I believe Richard Dillard, I can't remember who, but I think Richard Dillard said that a writer must be unafraid. And just unafraid. And at the time, I didn't quite understand because I thought, well, I'm afraid of whom? You know, friends or critics. No, I'm afraid of yourself. Because you have to be able to cut yourself open and go into the most dark, nasty, painful places and drag them all up and bring them to the surface, examine them, and share them with the world. And you know, I think Freud said once that writers who seek therapy, paying the therapist for the job they're doing themselves. and you know, I think that is true. So also I think that the best of writers, you know, like Morrison, for example, they knew how to take pain and turn it into love. And that's what, to me, you know, that's what books are about, fiction writing is about. It can never grow out of hate. But to find love for something that is so painful or ugly, it takes years, but it also takes courage.
That's a really good answer. I think all three of our novels, there's this kind of undercurrent of love that goes through all of them that in some ways is what keeps the protagonists alive. What keeps them going.
I actually don't think that it took courage to write Red Clay Susie. I think writing it gave me courage. And I'll explain. So I liken it to coming out. I came out to my family many years ago, over 30 years ago, as gay. And when I did it, I was in tears, and I was ashamed. And my parents were mortified, and they made it very clear that they were ashamed of me too. And writing this book, sharing this story, which I hope is a roadmap of sorts for my fellow fringies, as I've come to think of them, people who live their lives on the outside, people who are having a rough time of it, has been, I started writing it for myself, but I continued writing it and shared it, I hope, for others to find that roadmap, not a geographic road, but a road within themselves. But what I found is that this whole process has been a second coming out, not as one part of me, but as the whole me. And this time I'm not crying, and I'm not ashamed. And I have a wonderful partner who loves and supports me. I have a wonderful circle of friends, and my parents have pretty much come around.
And your story is being embraced. Your story is being welcomed and acknowledged
Right.
and embraced. Yeah, courage is kind of a loaded term. I was going to say that what my advice to young people. There's not a lot of young people. Young at heart, a lot of young at heart people, but young person. There's a young person back there. But I think my advice to young people would be: your life is going to be happier and more fulfilled the sooner you can come to the conclusion that you don't give a shit what other people think. The sooner you can realize that you can get to that point in life, the happier you're going to be. And unfortunately, we're raised in a culture, including most family cultures, where what the other person thinks is what's most important. But the sooner you can reach that point, and this is why I was saying I couldn't have written this earlier in life, in part because I needed that distance that you were talking about. I needed to be able to actually look back and process my life. But also, I don't think I would have had the courage to not give a shit what people think. I know that contradicts what I just said about how terrified I was on the release date, but it wasn't because of criticism of who I was. It was more because of the writing, criticism of the writing or something like that. But to open yourself up takes courage, and then to expose it takes courage. Do we want to take?
Yes, I want to thank you for your inspiration. My novel came out a year ago, and I had this in my heart since I was 14.
Wow.
And I went to Alsace-Lorraine, Germany, and I felt like I had been there before. I had a deja vu. So subsequently, I started studying Ian Stevenson at UVA, and everyone who believed in reincarnation. And I thought, I can't go out and express this. I want this to be a romance novel. So what I did was, I went ahead. It took years and years, of course you all know, and it was part of my soul, thinking, because I would reminisce on what was going on during the Napoleonic era. I was fascinated by that story, and I didn't have the courage to bring it forth. And recently I've had people that believe in reincarnation say, you need to write that again and put in there your present life with your past life. I'm just not up to that yet because this has a sequel. But anyway, you've given me some inspiration, and it has just recently, in the last 2 months, I'm coming out of my shell, and I'm just telling
Great.
people what I believe in. So thank you.
That's wonderful.
Thank
Congratulations.
you. Thank you.
I'm speaking for myself here, not for you, but I'm finding this disconcerting reality that I'm becoming more courageous about these kinds of things the older I get.
Right.
So it's like the more time is
Exactly.
running out, the more courage.
Exactly.
So if I make it,
Gotta write faster.
I gotta write faster. I gotta write faster.
That's true. I'm thinking
Exactly.
of that.
Any other? Yes.
Talk about not fitting in, and I think perhaps it goes in degrees, because I don't know, maybe it's the people I hang around with, or the people I read about or something. It seems like everybody feels that he or she doesn't fit in to a certain extent. I never felt I fit into academia, and I worked in it all my life. I kept thinking, boy, if people knew what a phony I was, they would really be surprised. So, you're in mental health and psychology and that sort of thing. I was just wondering if you find that with your research and people with whom you've spoken in perhaps a therapeutic setting or something like that, that when you scratch the surface of most people, to a certain extent they feel they don't fit in, unless perhaps they're the high school heartthrob football player or something like that, and everybody else doesn't fit in. In that case, he's the only one that fits in or she.
Yeah.
And I don't know. That's from what I've been able to read and in my own personal life and people with whom I hang out, I think that that is a universal feeling.
That's an interesting comment. I'm actually not a practicing therapist. I studied psychoanalytic theory as a theory of mind at Washington Psychoanalytic Institute. I teach global politics and security, so nothing to do with that. But that's a really interesting question. Does everybody feel to a certain degree that they don't really fit in? And I guess some of that is contextual. What is the context? Where are you? I think what you described, kind of imposter syndrome, I think is very common. Imposter syndrome.
I've always felt that.
Yeah.
Well, I've lived here for 28 years. But I come from a country that was like an incubator.
Yeah.
Everybody was the same. We wore the same clothes. We spoke the same, read the same books, the same speeches. So, when I was growing up, I was I was an only child, so I was always joking, telling my mom if I die, she could, just adopt a neighbor. And it was just, right. I mean, it was just it wasn't until I came here that I actually, I didn't even think about fitting in or not fitting in. But when I came here, everything is about the individual. And I thought, wow, all those people are just so different. And yes, how do they fit in? All those different people. But, somebody says that, like, if you're happy all the time, you're not paying attention. So I think it's the same thing. I think that's the way it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to fit in. That's how you can create a diverse democratic society where everybody is so different. So it's not about learning how to fit in, but about learning how to coexist with others.
I agree. I think feeling the other, feeling as an outsider, it's a human story. It's the human condition. I think that those who show themselves as being completely confident are hiding a lot of pain, and that's why literature is filled with outsider people, and that's why it's so healing. For me as a reader to read and to know that I'm not alone. I feel like an outsider, but I'm not alone in it. And that's what I think is another one of those powerful properties of literature.
Yeah.
To do what you're saying is to bring us all together.
Books. I always think that books are bridges. They bridge cultures, generations, right, past to present to future. So books are beacons of hope. To me, it's so international. I mean, I started writing, and I get asked this a lot because I've never written anything in Russian, which I'm ashamed to some degree. Now maybe I'm not, but I started writing here, but the single author who inspired me was Toni Morrison. I read her books. I wasn't raised here. I came here, 28 years ago. I was reading about characters, say the Bluest Eye in the 60s. I was reading about myself. And that's the power, the transcendence of literature, of great literature, that you feel part of something larger, that you don't fit, but you belong. And that was just such an inspiring and transcendental experience. And I was calling my friends, I remember this, I was calling my friends in Moscow and saying, I just read the most horrifying and the most beautiful of all novels, which was The Bluest Eye. It's my first encounter with Morrison. And they said, who's off? I said, Toni Morrison. And they said, who's that? Mm-hmm. It was 1992, I believe. They had no idea who she was. She still wasn't translated.
92.
Right. So they had no idea. No, actually it was 96, because I came here in 1996. They had no idea who she was. And so I remember I would go back there and bring books and would translate them passages of the page. We would just have a little reading circle, everybody had a little vodka going on. I'm translating off the page. And they were just astonished how much those passages spoke to them, to their humanity, it is her humanity, the humanity of her characters, speaking to someone from different cultures, different generations, but it's there. So, and it's so important, I think. That's what we all hope for, right?
Yes.
That's how we can build a better society.
That it
Amen.
connects, like Toni Morrison connected to you. Yeah. Well, I'm being told that you're out of. There is another question. Let me take one more question because I want to engage
Thank
the
you.
audience.
What filters or discussions are you having, if any, with publishers and agents regarding LGBTQ themes, which is now becoming, I guess, more of a movement, I say, to suppress from not only in public schools, but is now working its way into public libraries. If you're having any discussions with agents and publishers, can you share them with us?
Well, so the question, I don't know if it's picked up on the live stream, the question is what discussions are we aware of or having with agents or publishers with getting LGBTQ themed books, stories into libraries, into the marketplace. And so one of the things, my greatest wish is that a copy of Red Clay Susie will be in every public library, because great, I want to sell books, of course, but more importantly, I want this story and stories like it to be available to young people who are having a horrible time of life right now, because they may not be able to afford it. But public libraries, they're a lifeline to so many. Community centers, libraries, schools. That's where they're unsung heroes of our nation, I think. And so actually, one of the things that I'm doing, part of the proceeds for the sale of Red Clay Susie are going to two important organizations in my view, the Born This Way Foundation and the Trevor Project, that they do important work every day to not just save the lives, but enrich the lives of at-risk youth. So that's my contribution to this.
But if we could just focus for a moment, are you having like discussions or are agents saying, hey, can you tone it down a little bit? Can you maybe not use the word love as much? Can you maybe avoid this word? Or like, are they giving you filters, maybe subliminally, that you can use when you're doing your writing to either tone it down or tone it up, either way?
Not in my experience. In fact, my literary agent, the incomparable Mona Kanan, is a champion of me and what I'm trying to do, as well as other clients for that agency. And this might interest you as well. I published with a small independent press called Post Hill Press. They are known mostly for their nonfiction titles. And many of them are written by arch conservatives, people who have a similar political view to my family. And so when the offer came in, I wondered why, because this is not in their wheelhouse. It's fiction, it's a queer book, and I will not alter my message to meet the needs of a publisher or anybody else. But my agent and I talked to the acquisitions editor. Said, can you explain why Post Hill Press wants this book? And they said, we want to diversify we want to diversify our catalog. We want to have a more diverse representation among our authors. We want to tell important stories. And I love being part of the vanguard. I said, I'll go there with you, Post Hill Press. And my reasoning is, this is not, it's as much a human story as a political story. And I thought, if I publish with a non-traditional publisher for this kind of story, then I reach a different kind of audience. You could go to a publisher that publishes this kind of literature, and you're among others, which is great. We need all of them. But I wanted to take a stand with Post Hill Press, with my acquisitions editor, with my agent, and publish in a place where someone who might give my book a pass if it was published someplace else, they might think, okay, I'm going to pick that up. And in my view, that's one more queer kid who's better off. And in my view, my summary statement is, you don't make change by walking away or not engaging with people who have a similar or have a different viewpoint from you. You walk into the fray you engage, you have conversations, you try to change minds. That's my experience, and I hope others.
I can't speak to whether, how publishers or agents are feeling about this. My cynical answer to what your question is would be my publisher would probably be delighted if my book were banned. Because for publishers, it's about selling books.
Right.
And far more people are probably going to buy your book because it's banned than, sales you're going to lose. But just the other point about the whole issue you raised is while we talk about, the American ethos, unlike the Soviet ethos, is one of individualism and all that. It's still individualism within bounds. It's still very much be yourself, just don't do this, right? Be yourself, just don't love that person. So it's still a struggle. The immortal John Prine once said, I got kicked off of Noah's Ark. There was 2 of everything but 1 of me. So,
And I think that, if I had the publisher who would have, insisted on me adding, a gay character or taking a gay character out, I don't think I would have stayed with that publisher.
Yeah.
I mean, it's your work, it's your baby.
Exactly.
It's like telling you, okay, this man is no good, pick another man to be the father of your child. Nobody can tell you that.
I can tell you something. It's your
have
baby,
to,
like you
You
said.
have to write what you have to write, and I think the more diverse our stories are, the better we are as human beings in this society.
So please, everybody write to your school districts and tell them to ban our books. We all need the sales increase.
Mine is getting close, since it's Russian. So.
Yeah, because it's
Yeah.
Russian,
Yeah.
and that's a fascinating conversation too, but we don't have time for it. Thank you both very much. Thank you.